They laughed when billionaire Richard Langford vanished from the headlines, calling him a madman for trading his empire for a silent boy in a care home. But behind those cruel jokes was a truth no one saw coming. Richard didn't lose everything. He discovered everything. In a world obsessed with power and profit, he chose a child who couldn't speak but taught the world to listen. This isn't a story about a fallen CEO. It's about the quiet revolution of love that echoes louder than any empire ever could. They laughed when Richard Langford walked away from his empire. The headlines were merciless. Tech titan surrenders throne for personal reasons. From billionaire to babysitter, Silicon Valley's greatest mind just lost his own. He didn't answer the calls, didn't hold a press conference, didn't post a cryptic statement on social media. He simply packed 2 suitcases, left the headquarters of Langford Innovations, and drove 3 hours north until the city gave way to trees and the trees gave way to silence. He hadn't planned to stop. Not really, not forever. But something had broken, not with the markets, not with his board, not even with the company, with him. He had built too much and lost more than he admitted. The money had never been the problem. Neither had the fame. It was the emptiness that clung to every success like mold. So when the email came, one sentence, unsigned, unsent through any official channel, he didn't delete it. He's still waiting for you. He remembers the song you played. It made no sense, and then it made all the sense in the world. It was raining when Richard pulled up to the care home's graveled drive. Not the kind of rain that demanded attention, just the soft kind, steady, relentless, washing everything in gray. The woman who greeted him at the front desk looked like she had worked there since time began. She wore a name tag that said Marla and a cardigan with stitched flowers unraveling at the cuffs. She didn't ask for ID, didn't mention the news, just looked at him with tired eyes and nodded. He's in the music room, where he always is around this time. Richard walked slowly. The place hadn't changed much, still smelled of oatmeal and cleaning bleach, still echoed with 2 loud televisions and 2 soft voices. The boy was at the piano. His back was straight, his hands poised, but still, as if waiting for a cue that never came. The same worn bench, the same upright piano with chipped keys, the same cracked metronome ticking faintly beside a picture frame turned backward. Richard stopped in the doorway, unsure. The boy didn't turn. Then, very softly, he began to play. The notes were hesitant at first, half memorized, half improvised, but the melody was unmistakable. Bach, Prelude. In C. Richard's throat tightened. He stepped forward and placed a hand gently on the top of the piano. The boy didn't flinch, didn't stop playing, but his lips moved. You came back. Richard closed his eyes. His voice was rough when he spoke. I'm sorry it took me so long. The boy finished the piece and lowered his hands into his lap. His name was Jonah. He was 9 years old, and he had been waiting 3 years for a man he only remembered in pieces. Richard had first met Jonah during a corporate charity event. Langford Innovations had been sponsoring adaptive music programs for underfunded care homes, and someone in PR had suggested Richard make an appearance. He'd barely agreed, expecting little more than a photo op. What he hadn't expected was the boy. Jonah had been 7 then, small for his age, his limbs stiff with the telltale tension of cerebral palsy. He didn't speak, not then, barely made eye contact. But when his hand touched the piano keys, something happened. Not just movement, meaning, emotion, control. It was as if sound obeyed him in a way his body never had. Richard had stayed for an hour that day, then 2, then 4. He'd returned the next week, and the week after that. He brought better headphones, digital recorders, and once a compact electric piano, not for show, for Jonah, for the way the boy lit up when he understood that someone had brought it for him, not for a camera crew. And then he stopped coming. The acquisition of a rival company had demanded every hour of his time. His father died. His COO betrayed him. Stock prices crashed, surged, and crashed again. And the boy in the home with the two large shoes and the silent hands faded into the background, until the email, until this. Jonah turned on the bench now and looked at him, really looked. His eyes were sharper than Richard remembered, but still a little distant, like the boy existed half in his own world and half in this one. "Do you remember the story you told me?" Jonah asked. Richard blinked. "What story?" "About the man who built towers so tall they touched the clouds. And then he forgot why he built them." Richard sat beside him. "I think that was a fairy tale." Jonah shook his head slowly. "No, it was about you." Marla found them an hour later, the two of them still sitting at the piano. She said nothing, just handed Richard a folder. Inside were reports, evaluations, medical history, incident forms. Jonah had no family. His mother had died during childbirth. The state had placed him in 2 homes, both underfunded, both ill-equipped. No one had visited him in over 2 years. There were notes in red pen, words like difficult, nonverbal, inconsistent progress. But Marla had added her own, in blue ink, at the bottom of every page. Enjoys music, calms during classical piano, responds to Richard's visits with uncharacteristic focus, shows attachment. Richard read each line like a wound. That night he drove back to the hotel, but didn't sleep. He stared out the window at the trees and remembered a conversation he'd once had with a board member who told him empathy was a distraction. That leadership meant making hard choices, not soft ones. The next morning, Richard returned to the care home with legal papers. "I want to be his guardian," he told Marla. She blinked, stunned. "Do you understand what that means?" "No," Richard admitted. "But I know what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean leaving him here." And just like that, the man who had once been called the architect of a trillion-dollar empire became something else entirely. He became Jonah's father. The transition wasn't clean. Nothing about raising a child, much less one with Jonah's needs, ever was. Richard sold the lake house in Tahoe, donated the 3rd car, hired a speech therapist named Eileen who drove 2 hours each way, not because of the paycheck, but because she said she believed in starting where a child was, not where tests said he should be. He found a small house on the edge of town, not far from a school with a strong special education program and a music room with a Steinway someone had donated decades ago. He turned the garage into a therapy studio, installed ramps, removed thresholds, learned how to clean a G-tube, and how to anchor his panic during seizures. His hands, once used to signing billion-dollar deals, learned to button soft shirts with slow care and guide Jonah's fingers across ivory keys when muscle stiffness made playing impossible. He stopped checking Langford's stock, stopped taking calls from investors who used words like legacy and collapse in the same sentence. He measured his days in small victories. Jonah smiled when he got through the alphabet without freezing. He said "Dad" for the first time on a Wednesday morning, wearing mismatched socks and peanut butter on his chin. He fell asleep during thunderstorms instead of shaking against the wall. And every night, Richard sat at the foot of the bed and read the same story. Not from a book, from memory. Once there was a boy who couldn't speak, and a man who had forgotten how to listen. But one day, they sat beside each other, and the world got quieter until all that was left was the music. Jonah would close his eyes, and Richard would sit there, still, listening to the hum of the monitor, the wind through the window, and something else he hadn't heard in years. Peace. It wasn't perfect. There were regressions, screamed nights, bureaucracy that fought him at every turn, insurance, school systems, forms that didn't allow for nuance. But he didn't go back, not to the boardrooms, not to the suits. The world called it a disappearance. They said he'd lost everything. They said he cracked. They laughed. Until Jonah played again, this time in front of a crowd. And the truth came out. The auditorium was modest, The kind of school gym that smelled faintly of linoleum and glue, with folding chairs that creaked and fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. The winter recital was mostly for parents, recorders squeaking through jingle bells, cardboard angel wings, shy bows at the end of off-key choruses. But Jonah was last on the program, a solo piece. He walked onto the stage with his gait uneven and cautious, one hand clenched close to his chest, the other gripping the edge of the piano bench for support. The crowd grew quiet, not in discomfort but anticipation. They'd heard stories, whispers about the boy who couldn't speak but could make an entire room fall silent with a single note. Richard sat in the front row, hands clasped, trying to still their tremble. Jonah adjusted the bench just like Eileen had taught him and placed both hands on the keys. His fingers were rigid, his wrists tight, but they moved, slowly, carefully. The first note rang out, then another. Not perfection, not performance, expression. The piece was short, an adaptation of Clair de Lune, simplified to fit the way Jonah's fingers curled, but he played it through. No stumbles, no freezing. His body shook by the end, not from fear but effort. And when the last note faded, he looked toward Richard and their eyes met. Then the room stood, not clapping, standing, every parent, every teacher, every student. The applause came next, loud and uneven, like it didn't know how to match the moment. But no one sat, no one spoke. They just stood and watched as a boy who had once been considered unteachable bowed slightly and smiled, not because he'd won anything, but because he'd been heard. Afterward, a reporter who had been covering the event leaned over to Richard. "That was your son?" "Yes." The man cleared his throat. "You used to run Langford, didn't you? You gave it all up?" "I gave it away," Richard said. "To raise him? To know him?" The reporter shook his head softly. "People thought you lost your mind." "I did," Richard replied, "and I found something better." Within days, the video went viral. Not because of production or polish. A student had filmed it on their phone. The frame shook, the sound echoed. But it didn't matter, because something in the way Jonah played, in the way he looked to the crowd, not for approval but for connection, stirred something deeper than clicks or comments. The headlines changed. Former billionaire's son gives the performance of a lifetime. Jonah Langford teaches the world what it means to speak without words. Richard Langford's greatest invention wasn't a device, it was a life. They stopped laughing, and they started listening. Op-eds followed, think pieces, endless analysis. But none of them truly captured the reality. They speculated about Richard's motives, theorized a midlife crisis, hypothesized strategic philanthropy. But no one saw the mornings when Jonah's legs refused to move, and Richard carried him to the bathroom whispering jokes to mask the pain. No one saw the nights when he sat beside the bed, checking Jonah's oxygen levels while tracing song lyrics on his phone screen, wondering if his son could feel the rhythm even in sleep. They didn't see the frustration either, the government forms that made no room for exceptions, the insurance calls that lasted hours just to secure basic therapy sessions, the moments Richard would step outside, fists clenched, breath tight, and stare at the sky like it owed him something for the sheer injustice of it all. He hadn't chosen Jonah out of charity. He had chosen Jonah because the boy made him remember what mattered. Not the quarterly reports, not the stock splits, or the IPOs, or the accolades. Jonah, in his silence, in his patience, in his stubborn brilliance, had reminded Richard that the point of building anything, companies, machines, lives, was to connect, to witness, to lift. As the story spread, letters began arriving. From parents with children like Jonah, from adults who had once been children like Jonah, from musicians, therapists, and children who now ask their parents to let them try piano. Thousands of letters. One stood out. It came on crumpled paper, written in pencil. "My little brother doesn't talk either, but after watching your son, He walked to the piano in the church basement and touched the keys. I think he was trying to say hello. Richard pinned that one to the refrigerator. He looked at it every morning. In spring, the school district asked Jonah to open the new music wing. It had been rebuilt with donations that poured in after the recital. The grand piano had been restored. The therapy room had doubled in size. Jonah didn't play a piece that day. He just stood beside the ribbon with scissors in his trembling hands. It took him 2 full minutes to cut it, but when he did, the applause came again, softer this time, like the world had learned to match his pace. And for the first time, Jonah turned to the crowd and said 2 words clearly into the microphone. "Thank you." It was all he said. It was all he needed to. The invitations began piling in after that. Television networks wanted interviews. Medical journals requested commentary. A university offered Richard an honorary doctorate in human development. They sent embossed folders and handwritten notes. He didn't respond, not because he was ungrateful, but because none of those offers had anything to do with Jonah. Instead, he spent those weeks building shelves. He installed one in Jonah's room for puzzles, one in the hallway for music books, one in the garage for physical therapy equipment. The tools he used were old, the wood uneven, the screws a little off. But it didn't matter. Jonah watched him work and started handing him tools, his small hands memorizing the feel of the Phillips head, the satisfying click of the level. "You like this?" Richard asked once. Jonah nodded. So Richard bought extra wood, smaller nails, and a child-sized set of safety goggles. That weekend, they built a planter box for the front porch. Jonah insisted it have wheels so they could chase the sun. The words came slow, deliberate, 1 syllable at a time. But they came. And when it was finished, Jonah planted his favorite, white tulips. They bloomed early. That same month, a music therapist from Boston emailed Richard. She'd read about the recital and was launching a pilot program that used classical music therapy with children who had severe motor delays. She asked if Jonah might contribute. An interview, a case study, anything. Richard was ready to decline until he asked Jonah. The boy blinked, then nodded. They scheduled a video call. When the day came, Jonah wore his cleanest sweater and combed his hair for 10 straight minutes until it sat just right. He sat beside Richard in front of the laptop, nervously tapping his fingers against the table. When the therapist's face appeared, warm and wide-eyed, Jonah offered a small smile. She asked if he remembered his first time playing. Jonah said, "No," then added, "But I remember the sound." "What sound?" He thought about it, then looked at Richard. The song he made when he waited. Richard's throat caught, and he remembered. It was during one of those early visits to the care home when Jonah hadn't played a note, hadn't even looked at the keys. Richard had sat beside him, unsure what to do, so he hummed. Nothing specific, just a made-up tune, slow and soft and circular. He hadn't realized Jonah was listening. The therapist teared up. "Do you still remember that song?" Jonah nodded. His hands lifted, and then, with trembling fingers, he began to play it. The camera caught it all. It wasn't perfect, but it was clear. The pilot program received a grant 2 weeks later. They named the curriculum the Jonah Sequence. More letters arrived. One from a mother in Dublin who said her daughter had finally sat at a piano after years of refusing physical therapy. Another from a school principal in Kenya whose students now ended the school day with 10 minutes of music in honor of the boy who speaks through sound. The planter box grew too heavy to roll. Jonah built a second one, then a birdhouse, then a wind chime that only worked when the breeze hit just right. Each project added something new to their small home. Not wealth, not accolades, but proof that Jonah wasn't just surviving. He was building. And Richard, who had once thought success lived in skyscrapers, learned to measure progress in laughter, in lifted spoons, in bedtime stories read without fear of interruption. One night, as Richard finished tying Jonah's braces and pulling the covers over his legs, the boy looked up and asked, "Did they stop laughing?" "Who?" "The people. The ones who didn't understand." Richard sat down on the edge of the bed. "I think they're listening now." "Good," Jonah said, already halfway to sleep, "because I'm not done talking." Neither of them were. The following fall, Jonah enrolled in a special arts academy 45 minutes from their home. It wasn't prestigious, no ivy-covered towers, no corporate donors, but the principal had once been a music therapist herself, and the school had a full-time adaptive instruction team. The moment they toured the campus, Jonah's shoulders lifted. Not visibly, not in any dramatic gesture, but Richard could see it. The quiet way the boy's eyes tracked the sound of the wind chimes hanging outside the music hall. The way he lingered in the sculpture lab, gently running his fingers over clay that hadn't yet dried. It wasn't about prestige, it was about place. When they met with the school's admissions counselor, a woman named Carmen, who wore rainbow glasses and had a voice like a lullaby, she asked Jonah what he wanted to do here. He tapped his fingers slowly, thoughtfully, against the table. "Make songs," he said, "with other people." That was all he said, but it was enough. That year changed everything. Jonah joined a collaborative composition group. He began learning to use music notation software that tracked finger motion instead of key presses. He recorded audio samples for the school's sound library, his breathing, his laughter, the creak of his wheelchair, the thunk of his hand against wood, and wove them into compositions that sounded like the inside of a memory. For the first time, his name was printed beneath a concert program not as a beneficiary, but as a composer. One piece was performed by the upper orchestra in a winter showcase. It was called "Hands in Rain." The opening featured no instruments, just silence, followed by light taps and the soft hiss of air blown across strings. Then piano, then cello, then faintly a bell sound that came from a recording of Jonah's braces clinking against a stair rail. The crowd didn't know how to react. Some cried. Others simply stared at the stage long after the players had lowered their bows. Afterward, a music teacher from another school approached Richard with awe in her eyes. "Where did he learn to compose like that?" Richard smiled. "He's been doing it since before he could speak." Jonah's fame grew, but not in the way Richard once understood fame. There were no sponsorships, no red carpets. Instead, there were university emails asking to study his work, museums requesting audio samples for their accessibility exhibits, students across the world remixing Jonah's pieces for their own performances and tagging him in homemade videos titled "Inspired by Jonah Langford." And still, every morning, Richard packed Jonah's lunch, helped him stretch, and drove him to school in the same dented van with the side door that sometimes jammed. They had helpers now, 2 aides who alternated days, a nurse who visited twice a week, and a mobility specialist who came on weekends to build an adaptive piano stool from scratch. But Richard did most of it. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. Because every time he watched Jonah press a key, build a sound, or laugh when something didn't quite work, Richard saw more than growth. He saw legacy, not the kind measured in buildings or awards, but in the slow, patient work of raising a life. And in that work, he finally understood what success had never taught him. That the greatest empires are not built in boardrooms. They are built in living rooms, on bathroom floors during seizures, in whispered lullabies and bedtime stretches, in tulip planters, and in the long, quiet years where the world waits for a child to find his voice and discovers, when he does, that it's a sound no one can ignore. One evening, near the end of spring, Jonah wheeled himself into the living room holding a stack of printouts. They were slightly wrinkled from the tray on his chair, smudged with graphite and fingerprints. Richard was in the kitchen, elbows deep in soap suds, scrubbing the burnt edges of a lasagna pan. "I want to show you something," Jonah said. Richard dried his hands and followed him to the table. Jonah spread the pages carefully, sheet music, handwritten notes, sketched diagrams. One of the pages showed a concert hall, not a grand one, but open and round, with no front, no back, no stage. The players sat in the center, and the audience encircled them on all sides. "It's called the Circle," Jonah said. "It's a piece, but also a place." Richard sat, eyes scanning every detail. The notes were incomplete, the architecture rough, but the idea was unmistakable. A performance that dissolved the line between artist and observer, a space that gave as much as it received. "Can we build it?" Jonah asked quietly. "Build what?" "The concert, the Circle, not later. Now, he paused. "Before the seizures get worse." Richard felt the words like glass in his throat. The doctors had warned them. The type of epilepsy Jonah had was unpredictable. It came in waves. Sometimes he went months without an episode. Sometimes they arrived daily. They hadn't talked much about what came next. Jonah knew, but he'd never said it aloud. "Yes," Richard said, "we'll build it." They spent the next 4 months preparing. Richard called everyone he knew, designers, engineers, artists, teachers. They didn't ask for pay. They just asked when to show up. A former classmate who now worked in acoustic design mapped the sound field for a circular performance. An architecture student from Brazil submitted renderings that made Jonah cry. A retired composer from New York wrote a prelude to introduce Jonah's piece. They found an abandoned civic hall near the water. Richard paid the city $1 to lease it for a year. Volunteers restored the seats, painted the walls, rewired the lights. They made ramps out of reclaimed wood, installed a central lift for Jonah's piano. Every inch of the space was designed not just to accommodate, but to invite. When it was ready, Jonah sent out the invitations himself. Every letter was different. Some were typed, some drawn. Some were little more than a few words. "I remember you smiled at me once. Please come." The night of the performance, the hall filled slowly, not with celebrities or critics, with people who had walked alongside Jonah's journey, nurses, aides, classmates, janitors, delivery drivers, neighbors, people who had seen him stumble and stutter, fall and rise, repeat the same scale 100 times until he could play it with one clear breath. The lights dimmed. Jonah wheeled himself into the center. No fanfare, no announcement, just silence. Then a single note, then another. He didn't speak, didn't need to. He played the Circle in full, a suite of shifting time signatures, layered loops, and melodies pulled from life. The beeping of monitors, the hiss of oxygen, the whisper of paper turning, the click of braces, all woven into sound. The room held its breath. When it ended, there was no applause at first, only stillness. Then Jonah raised one hand. The audience responded, not with clapping, but by humming. Soft, imperfect, all around him, one by one people joined. Different tones, different rhythms, like the whole room had become an instrument. Richard sat in the front row, tears slipping silently down his face. It wasn't a concert, it was communion. It was the sound of one life, echoed by hundreds. And in that moment, the truth came out. Not in words, but in the undeniable, unrepeatable proof that love, when chosen, builds louder than empire ever could. After the concert, there were no interviews, no press releases. Jonah didn't care for cameras, and Richard didn't care for legacy. They lingered long after the audience had gone, sitting in the center of the space Jonah had imagined and willed into being. The piano still sat before them, its final note long since faded into the night, but the feeling remained. A charged stillness, like a dream that refused to end. Jonah leaned back in his chair, exhausted but glowing. His hands twitched in his lap, still tense from effort, but a smile traced his lips like sunlight across frost. "Was that real?" he whispered. "Yes," Richard said, "every second." They sat there for hours, the moon rising slowly through the tall windows, casting pale light across the polished floor. A janitor came in once pushing a broom, saw them, and quietly turned back around. The next morning they returned home to their small house, the tulip planter now overgrown and spilling into the walkway, the birdhouse leaning slightly to the left. Richard made eggs. Jonah stirred orange juice with a bent straw. The ordinary settled in around them like a favorite sweater, loose, soft, lived in. But something had changed. That week, letters came from people who had been at the performance. One was from a teacher who had brought her entire class. She wrote, "My students didn't talk afterward. They just sat in the bus in silence. That's never happened before." One of them finally said, "That was the first time I've seen someone like me make something that big." Another came from a man who had walked 3 miles to get there. He was a former veteran, now wheelchair-bound, who wrote in shaking pen, "I stopped going places because people always see the chair before they see me. But your son invited me in with sound." Jonah read them slowly, mouthing the words, sometimes stopping to underline sentences with a green marker. He pinned some to his wall, folded others into his music folder. Then he began to compose again. Richard asked him once, "Where do you get the ideas?" Jonah looked out the window. From the world when it's quiet enough to hear, there was a new stillness in him, not absence, not fatigue. Something deeper, like the stillness of a candle after the wind stops. The seizures began again that summer. They weren't as long as they used to be, but they came with new sharpness, new fear. Jonah recovered slowly, sometimes not at all for days. Sometimes his words slurred. Sometimes he couldn't play. Richard sat beside him, holding his hand, reading the same book he had read for years, the same stories, the same voice. They stopped leaving the house as much. The world came to them instead. Former students sent music to Jonah for review. Kids mailed recordings of them trying the circle, often adding their own sounds, bird calls, laughter, even rain on tin roofs. Jonah listened to every one. He didn't always respond, but when he did, his feedback was short, kind, specific. He never corrected, he encouraged. Try to start softer. Too many sounds. Pick 2. This one made me cry. That's good. By the end of the year, his compositions had been featured in 15 student concerts, 6 school curriculums, and 1 gallery exhibit in Norway. But no one promoted it, no marketing campaign. It spread because people heard it and shared it, because truth spreads like that when it's real. And what Jonah made was real. It was undeniable. And he had done it not with power, not with speed, not with the machinery of empire, but with the slow, defiant grace of a boy who had once been left behind and now led the world forward with music in his bones and silence in his soul. Autumn came with gold and quiet. The trees around their home blushed red, then let go one leaf at a time, carpeting the yard in fire. Jonah's health waned, not sharply, but steadily. Some days were bright, others were shadows. His appetite thinned. His fingers grew slow, but he still played, if not the piano, then with sound. With the tap of spoons against cups, the scratch of pencils across paper, the hush of wind against window panes. He began recording things, everyday noises, a squeaky cabinet hinge, the slow drip from the outdoor faucet, the static between radio stations. He cataloged them on a tablet Richard had modified for him, each file neatly named, each time-stamped. The folder was titled simply, Staying. When Richard asked him what it meant, Jonah replied, "So I can still be here, even when I can't." Richard couldn't answer. He just nodded and sat beside him while they listened to the world. That winter, Jonah composed his last full piece. He called it For the Spaces That Hold Us. It had no melody in the traditional sense. It was built entirely from ambient sounds, the clinking of dishes, the creak of his wheelchair, Richard's voice reading stories, birdsong from the early hours, the soft pop of logs in the fireplace. He arranged them with precision, layering texture over texture, stitching silence between every moment like thread. It premiered online. Jonah didn't want a concert this time. Too many lights, he'd said with a tired smile. Instead, it appeared on a single website with no banner, no links, just a white screen and a play button. Anyone who listened would hear 15 minutes of their own home, if their home had been built with love, with struggle, with time. It was played over 2 million times in a month. No one made a documentary, no one sold T-shirts. It just was. And still Jonah smiled when he heard it, not because it was finished, but because it existed, because it would be there. "Forever?" he asked Richard one night, his voice faint. "As long as someone presses play," Richard said. "Then I'm not scared." The end didn't come all at once. It never does. There were good days, even near the last. Mornings filled with honey on toast and old songs played too loud. Afternoons of sun through curtains and sketching sounds on napkins. Evenings where Jonah sat bundled in 3 blankets, watching snow fall and murmuring, "It's like music when it lands." Then one morning, he didn't wake up. The sun rose anyway. Richard sat beside him for hours, one hand on Jonah's, the other resting on the piano lid. He didn't cry, not at first. He just breathed and remembered. The birdhouse, the concert, the first time Jonah said, "Dad," the sound of tulips brushing one another in the wind. And then, finally, Richard wept. Because what they had built wasn't made of stone or stock or structure. It was made of music and time and the small, quiet bravery of choosing love over legacy. He buried Jonah beneath the apricot tree in the backyard. Spring would come and the blossoms would fall like confetti. He would plant tulips again, this time all white. And when he played the piano, he would leave one key untouched, the one Jonah always began with. And even when no one else could hear it, Richard would know he was still speaking. News of Jonah's passing spread quietly. There were no headlines, no breaking reports, just a soft ripple moving through the lives he'd touched. Emails poured in, handwritten letters followed. Some sent flowers, others sent music. Children in faraway schools held moments of silence, their teachers explaining, gently, that the boy who taught the world how to listen had gone somewhere beyond sound. Richard read every letter, every message. He stored them in boxes labeled not by date but by tone. Joy, gratitude, stories. There were hundreds, then thousands. One envelope arrived with no return address, just a single sheet of paper and a stick figure drawing of a boy and a man at a piano. Below it, in wobbly pencil, "Because of Jonah, I talk to my dad now." Richard framed that one. He didn't return to Langford. Though the company sent formal condolences, offers to name wings and scholarships after Jonah, Richard declined each one. Jonah hadn't been a monument. He had been a boy, a son, a note in a measure that changed everything because it came exactly when it was needed. Instead, Richard built something else. He called it the Quiet House, not a clinic, not a school, a space. A place where children like Jonah could come, some with disabilities, some with trauma, some simply unseen, and make sound. Any kind. Piano, spoons, wind chimes, silence. There were no expectations, only welcome. He funded it himself quietly, drawing from the fortune he had once hoarded like armor. Architects asked what to build, and Richard said, "Make sure the walls are soft and the doors don't echo when they close." When it opened, they didn't hold a ceremony. The first visitor was a boy named Luis who'd stopped speaking after his father died. He walked the halls in silence for an hour. Then he sat at one of the keyboards and pressed a single note, then another. The room didn't applaud. It waited, and Luis smiled. 1 week later, 23 more children came, then 60, then 100. Word spread not because of promotion, but because families told each other, "There's a place where our kids are not interruptions. They are the music." Richard lived in a small house on the property. He kept the original piano in his living room. He played every evening at sunset, sometimes by himself, sometimes with visitors, always starting with Jonah's key. He never remarried, never sought to replace what he had. Instead, he spent each day building new spaces. He wasn't trying to change the world anymore. He was trying to keep open the door that Jonah had helped him walk through. The door where love was louder than legacy, where empire meant nothing if it wasn't built to shelter someone else, where the truth of a life was measured not in what it earned, but in what it heard. And in that quiet, in that space between music and memory, Richard still found him, still found Jonah, still found everything that had ever truly mattered. One evening, many years later, a young journalist arrived at the quiet house. Her name was Tess, barely 24, with a worn notepad and a heart full of questions. She had grown up hearing whispers of Jonah Langford, the boy who played sound like it was thread, who stitched broken pieces of the world together one key at a time. She had read the letters, watched the grainy recital footage, heard the music passed from teacher to student across continents. But she had never heard Richard speak. No one really had, not publicly. She was nervous. She expected to be turned away. Instead, Richard met her at the door. He was older now, white-haired, shoulders slightly stooped, but his eyes were the same steel blue that had once stared down boardrooms, softened now by loss, warmed by love. They sat on the back porch, the evening sun painting long shadows across the grass. The birdhouse Jonah built still stood, repainted twice but never replaced. Wind moved gently through the trees. Tess opened her notepad. "I don't want to ask about the company or the fortune," she said. "I want to ask about him. Jonah." Richard smiled faintly. He hated interviews. "I won't print anything unless you want me to," she said. "But people still listen to his music, even now, and no one really knows what happened after. Not in your words." He didn't speak for a long time. Then, "You know how some people are born loud. Not with volume, but presence. Jonah wasn't like that. He didn't take up space. He taught space how to hold him. Do you understand?" Tess nodded. "He didn't want the world to bend around him," Richard continued. "He just wanted it to let him stand." She turned the page. "And you? Why did you walk away from it all?" "I didn't walk away," Richard said. "I walked toward him." A pause, a breeze. "Everything I built before him was noise, clever, lucrative noise. But Jonah taught me what it meant to listen. He made me worthy of silence. Do you know how rare that is?" She blinked back sudden tears. "And the music?" she asked softly. "What was it like to watch him play?" Richard looked out at the yard, where two children now chased one another across the grass, their laughter rising like birds. "It was like watching the world forgive itself," he said. They sat there until the sun was gone, and the sky turned navy and deep. Tess closed her notebook, but didn't move. "I'm going to write about him," she said eventually. "Not as a miracle, but as a mirror." Richard nodded. That's what he was. And in the silence that followed, Jonah's music seemed to return, not in notes, but in the hush of understanding, in the weight of having truly known someone, in the truth that remained when all the laughter, all the doubt, all the empire was gone. Just love, still echoing, still enough. Years continued to pass. The quiet house expanded slowly, deliberately. There was never a marketing plan, never a strategy deck or growth targets. Just need and response. A second property was built in Oregon, then another in Nova Scotia. One opened in South Africa, then two more in Southeast Asia. Not franchises, reflections. Each location shaped by the children who used them, the families who carried both grief and brilliance into the space and asked only that it make room. At each one, a room was set aside for listening. No devices, no appointments, just a circle of chairs and soft flooring, and a piano with one key marked in blue. Jonah's key. People came to that room not always to talk, but to sit, to breathe. Some brought their children. Some brought memories. Some brought questions that had waited years for a voice brave enough to answer. Richard visited them all. He moved slowly now, his cane tapping out a quiet rhythm with each step. But his mind remained sharp, and his presence never lost its weight. Wherever he walked, people straightened, then softened. He didn't teach. He listened. He didn't command. He asked. In Tokyo, he sat with a 6-year-old girl who wouldn't speak to anyone but her older brother, and only in made-up songs. In Istanbul, he helped a teenager wire a speaker system into her wheelchair so she could play chimes instead of using words. In a village outside Bogota, he sat with a family who had walked 10 kilometers to ask if their son, nonverbal and deaf, might still be welcome. Richard had only smiled. He's already here. When asked why he continued, why he hadn't written a book or taken a position on a board or given a single paid speech, Richard only said, "Because I know what it means to have your life saved quietly, without applause, without anyone knowing but you." On the 10th anniversary of Jonah's passing, a group of children in the first quiet house organized a concert, not to commemorate him, to thank him. They called it "The Song We Built." It was written by 50 students across 3 languages with no formal composition training. It included marbles rolling down rails, footsteps on gravel, a whispered lullaby recorded from a grandparent, and the rustle of paper wings worn by a child in a wheelchair who said she dreamed of flight. Richard sat in the front row. He wore the same sweater he'd worn to Jonah's recital. When the music started, he closed his eyes. And when it ended, he opened them to a room full of children looking not for approval, but connection. They bowed. He stood. And somewhere, deep in the silence that followed, a sound lingered. Familiar, steady, true. Jonah, always Jonah. Later that night, long after the chairs had been folded and the lights dimmed, Richard remained seated in the hall. The last note of the concert still clung to the rafters like mist refusing to burn off. He sat perfectly still, cane resting across his knees, hands folded like a prayer he'd never spoken aloud. The floor beneath him had been swept. The echoes faded, but the space still hummed, not with music, but with memory. One of the staff walked in, paused when she saw him, then gently offered, "Would you like some tea?" Richard shook his head. Not yet. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. Maybe he hoped, foolishly, that Jonah might enter one more time, wheeling forward with a stack of papers, or a song built out of refrigerator hums and breath. Maybe he thought that if he sat long enough, he might hear his son's voice again, shaped not in words, but in the creak of old wood and the hush of unspoken love. But no miracle came, just the night. Still, that was enough. Back in his room, Richard took out a worn folder from the drawer beside his bed. Inside it, Jonah's original sketches. His first written piece, a napkin on which he'd drawn a concert hall with little arrows pointing to wind and water and chairs that don't scrape. Notes from teachers, letters from strangers. A single photo of Jonah at the piano, head tilted, lips curved just slightly. What passed for a full smile in Jonah's careful vocabulary of expression. Richard had added nothing to the folder in years. He didn't need to. What lived in it had never faded. The next morning, he rose before dawn and went outside. The garden was still wet from last night's rain. He walked past the tulip beds, where new buds were beginning to stretch skyward, and out toward the bench under the apricot tree. It had grown taller, thicker. Its roots had pushed up the soil in ripples. Its blossoms had begun to open. He sat there as light crept over the horizon. Birds stirred. Somewhere in the quiet house, a child stirred too, perhaps waking to a new sound and wondering how to hold it. And Richard, eyes soft and distant, reached into his pocket and pulled out a small recorder. He pressed record. Let it begin again, he thought. One sound at a time, one story more. The first sound Jonah ever recorded had been rain, not on purpose. Richard had left the audio recorder running after a lesson, and later that evening, while transferring the files, he noticed the extra minutes. At first it was just room tone, quiet clicks, faint echoes. But then came the rain, not heavy, gentle, tapping against the window, whispering through the trees outside, a natural lullaby. Jonah hadn't said anything about it, but the next day, when Richard handed him the recorder again, Jonah placed it on the windowsill before sitting at the piano. That became their routine. The music of the world, captured and played back. It started with rain, then moved on to wind, then bird song, then the sounds of a playground in the distance. Jonah would sit with his head tilted as he listened to the recordings, sometimes for an hour, tapping his fingers in the air as if composing notes only he could see. He would then recreate the rhythms on the piano, slow, deliberate, fragmented at first, but all was growing into something more. Years later, after Jonah was gone, Richard found that old recorder again. It had been tucked into a drawer beneath a stack of bills and insurance statements, left behind in the chaos of grief and survival. The battery was long dead, the plastic cracked, but the files remained. He plugged it into his laptop and listened. Rain, wind, laughter, a recording of Jonah saying the word again softly, a request for the sound to be played one more time. Richard sat in the dark with headphones on, tears running silently down his cheeks. He spent the next weeks digitizing every file Jonah had ever created. He cataloged them, labeled them, built a library, not for profit, not for publication, but for preservation, for legacy. He called it the Archive of Quiet. It began as a private act of remembrance, but as word spread, people began to send in their own recordings, children, parents, teachers, sounds that reminded them of peace, of presence, of Jonah. A child in Indonesia sent the sound of waves slapping a bamboo boat. A girl in Finland sent her mother's voice reading bedtime stories. An elderly man in Maine sent a recording of his wife's breathing as she slept. Richard listened to them all. He hired a technician to build a server, then another to design a simple website. It had no menu, no branding, just a single instruction: press play. Each time someone clicked, they would hear a random file from the archive. No name, no description, just a gift. It went viral within weeks. Soon it had 1 million plays, then 10 million. Mental health professionals began recommending it for therapy. Musicians began remixing the files into compositions. Teachers played them in classrooms as mindfulness exercises. And still, Richard refused to monetize it. He ignored offers from streaming platforms, media companies, even a film studio that wanted to make a documentary. He declined interviews. He never stepped back into the spotlight, because none of it had ever been about him. Jonah's music had never asked to be famous. It had asked to be felt. One morning, a boy and his mother arrived at the quiet house unannounced. The boy was 7, barely spoke, wore noise-canceling headphones. The mother looked tired, guarded, but hopeful. She held a folded letter. Richard met them at the entrance, cane in hand, warm eyes steady. "I know this place isn't a hospital," the woman said, "but someone sent us a song from your archive. My son listened to it every night for a week, and then he started making noises, new ones, rhythms. I think he's trying to communicate." She held out the letter. It was from her son's occupational therapist. It simply read, "He heard something that made him want to respond." Richard knelt slowly beside the boy. "Do you want to come inside?" he asked. The boy nodded. They spent 2 hours in the sound garden, a room filled with interactive instruments and soft surfaces. The boy didn't speak, but he touched everything: tuned bowls, chimes, padded drums. Richard gave him space, letting him move freely. At one point, the boy stopped at the wall-mounted piano and pressed one note, the same note Jonah always started with. Richard felt something deep and low stir inside him. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The music had never stopped. It had only changed form. He returned to his cottage that night, lit a single candle, and pulled out Jonah's favorite blanket, the one with planets on it, worn thin from years of naps and late-night stories. He wrapped it around his shoulders and sat at the old upright piano. His fingers weren't as strong as they used to be. They trembled slightly as he positioned them. But he found the key. He pressed it, and then he played, not one of Jonah's pieces, not a famous composition, but something new, something simple, just the sound of a father remembering how to speak through song. It wasn't perfect, but it was true. And when he was done, he let the silence return, not empty, full, still, but never quiet. Because somewhere someone else was listening, and Jonah, his son, his symphony, his truth, was still being heard. He began writing again the following morning, not with the intent of publishing, not for legacy, just for himself and for Jonah. The notebook was simple, leather-bound, worn at the edges from where it had rested untouched on a shelf for years. He wrote slowly, hand cramping often, but each word felt necessary, like mortar between stones. He wrote of mornings making tea while Jonah hummed, of brushing his son's teeth while quietly singing behind him so Jonah wouldn't flinch, of the day Jonah tied his own shoes for the first time and then undid them immediately just to do it again. He wrote the story no one else could write, not the one that had appeared in headlines or in award ceremonies or in op-eds from well-meaning strangers. The real one. The one that began not with a resignation from an empire, but with a boy sitting quietly in a care home, hands still in his lap, waiting to be seen. He remembered everything. The first time Jonah cried, not because of pain, but because of music. The quiet afternoon when Richard caught him staring out the window at kids playing tag, his face unreadable, and then turning back to his sketch pad to draw not the kids, but the shadow their movement left on the ground. Jonah had never begged to be understood. He had simply asked the world to slow down long enough to recognize him. By the end of the week, Richard had filled 3 notebooks. He placed them on a shelf above the piano, not to forget, but to remember when it mattered most. When he felt the ache of silence too sharply, when the chair across from his felt too empty, when he needed to feel Jonah's mind near. Each day children still arrived at the quiet house. They came with their parents or teachers or sometimes alone. Some didn't speak, some didn't move much. Some flinched at the world. All of them entered a place designed for who they were, not who others expected them to be. And still, every so often, one of them would find Jonah's key. There was no plaque, no instruction, but they always knew. They pressed it softly, reverently, and the sound would ripple through the space, not just the room, but the people in it. And Richard would lift his eyes from whatever he was doing and smile. One day, a teenage boy with autism, who had never spoken in public, stood beside that very piano and tapped Jonah's key 3 times before turning to the audience. He said, "Thank you for listening." That was all. But it was enough. On the anniversary of Jonah's birth, Richard invited no one. He woke early, brewed tea, carried a folding chair out to the apricot tree, and sat in the sun. The bird song was sharp that day, the air still, the kind of quiet that had weight. He closed his eyes and listened to the creak of wood, the rustle of leaves, the tiny tap of falling fruit. And in those sounds, Jonah was everywhere. He didn't need more. He had already been given everything. It rained that night. Not a storm, not wind, just a soft, steady curtain of water over the roof. Richard didn't move from his chair under the apricot tree, even as the drops darkened the blanket over his knees. He watched the garden blur, the tulips bend, the edges of the planters swell and spill over. Somewhere behind him, someone from the quiet house cracked open the back door, hesitated, then left him alone. They knew better than to interrupt. He liked the rain. Jonah had liked it too, especially the way it sounded on the windows. He used to call it sky music. Sometimes he would sit beneath a blanket with his headphones on, not listening to any recording at all, just watching water trickle down the glass, tracing each stream with a finger like it was a note sliding down a staff. The next morning, Richard rose early, aching as always, his knees stiff, his back tight. He moved slowly through the quiet house, greeting the early staff with a nod, watching the first group of children arrive. One boy, maybe 6 or 7, darted from his mother's hand to the sensory garden, where he immediately knelt in the gravel and began to draw with a stick. He drew a circle, then another inside it, then a third, smaller still. Richard watched for a moment, then knelt beside him. "Do you know what that is?" he asked gently. The boy nodded without looking up. "It's a song. Can you sing it?" The boy shook his head. "You have to listen to it. It's quiet." Richard closed his eyes, listened, not to noise, to meaning, to presence. The boy tapped a rhythm in the dirt, slow, uneven, beautiful. And there it was again. Jonah, not in form, but in echo, in legacy, in the permission he'd given the world to slow down, to hear, to feel, and it was spreading, far past anything Richard could have planned or managed or scaled. It was in motion now, self-sustaining. A song passed from child to child, generation to generation, forever unfinished, forever whole. That evening, Richard pulled the old leather-bound journals from the shelf above the piano. He had written in them only once since Jonah's passing, a single line on a blank page 2 years ago. "He taught me how to stay." Now he turned to a new page and wrote again. He's still teaching. He left the book open. The next morning, a visiting student, a girl from a school in Colorado, walked past the piano, noticed the journal, read the last page, and turned it. She wrote, "I didn't think anyone would ever listen to me, but Jonah did, even from far away." Others followed. Within weeks, the journal became something else, part tribute, part conversation, part chorus. Pages filled with sketches, notes, tiny poems, handprints traced in pencil. It was never announced, never explained, just shared, a living memory, built line by line. On the final page, when the last space had been filled, someone wrote in bright blue ink, "The song never ended, it just changed hands." And Richard, standing beneath the apricot tree that spring, felt the wind pick up, gentle and full, like breath, like grace. He closed his eyes and pressed his palm against the bark, listening, always listening. The apricot tree bloomed harder that year than it ever had. Each branch was heavy with petals, pale and soft, shedding into the wind like whispered thoughts. Children from the quiet house took to collecting the fallen blossoms in glass jars, setting them on window sills and piano lids, naming them after the songs they loved most. One girl called hers Patience. Another labeled hers Flight. A third, barely old enough to write, simply called her jar Jonah. Richard noticed, but he didn't interrupt. He had long ago learned that meaning, like music, could never be assigned, only discovered. One afternoon in late May, a letter arrived at the quiet house in an envelope thick with foreign stamps. It had traveled from India, from a remote music conservatory that had recently adopted elements of the Jonah sequence. The sender was a teacher named Anika. Her letter was written by hand in careful, looping script. "I never met your son, but I've been teaching his method for years, not as curriculum, as invitation. We call it listening forward, the act of hearing what someone might become before they know how to show you. Last week, one of my students, who is both blind and nonverbal, composed a 5-minute piece entirely from touch patterns and breath. She asked me to send it to the man who made that possible, so here it is. On a USB, no name, no titles, just music. Thank you for listening." Richard opened the small package and played the file that evening on the old speaker in the music room. He sat there for 5 minutes, hands in his lap, body still. By the second minute he was crying. Not because the music was sad, because it was alive, because it was brave, because it was Jonah, passed hand to hand across oceans, living now in someone else's fingertips. He left the USB on the center table where visiting students could hear it. They began to add their own. A drawer was cleared, labeled Future Echoes. By the end of the summer, it was full. They built a new drawer, then another. Eventually, an entire wall was devoted to it, not a display, a growing instrument, not finished, never finished. One day, Richard walked the garden paths with a little boy named Carlo. The boy rarely spoke, but he loved the drums. That morning, he had discovered he could mimic a heartbeat with a pair of soft mallets and a padded floor. He tapped it now as they walked, boom, 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 perfectly steady, his face serious, his eyes clear. "What's that rhythm?" Richard asked. Carlo thought for a moment, then tapped it again. "Jonah," he said. Richard looked at the boy, stunned. "You never met him?" "No," Carlo said, "but I feel him when I listen." Richard reached out and gently took his hand. "You're not wrong." That evening, for the first time in months, Richard sat down at the piano. He rested his fingers on the keys. He wasn't sure what he was going to play, so he began, as always, with Jonah's key, and let whatever followed come without judgment. He played for hours. When the staff arrived to lock up, they didn't stop him. They just stood at the doorway listening, and outside in the trees the wind kept time. He played until his fingers ached, until his wrists trembled, until the muscles that age had turned stiff forgot they were tired. The piano held him like it always had, its keys smooth and familiar under skin that had once signed documents that moved billions and now summoned sound with the gentleness of a father holding an infant. When the last note faded, the room remained still, hushed in that sacred way only music could command. A breeze passed through the open windows. Somewhere, a wind chime sang, a small one made of shells, strung by a girl named Leah during a therapy session the previous week. She'd hung it near the garden and declared it a portal to peace. Richard had smiled when she said it. He believed her now. He rose slowly from the bench, joints creaking, but heart full. He hadn't played like that since Jonah's last spring, not in a full, complete way. Bits and pieces, sure, a few notes here, a phrase there, but not like this, not from beginning to end with no thought to who might hear or why. He made his way outside and found a circle of children sitting cross-legged in the grass. They were surrounding one of the tactile sound boards, a large disc embedded into the ground that vibrated with tones when touched. They were inventing a song together, each child pressing their hands to a different quadrant. The melody they created was unlike anything rehearsed. No pattern, just exploration, just joy. One of the children looked up and saw him. "Did you hear it?" she asked. "I did," Richard said. "What was it about?" He took a moment before answering. "It was about being heard, even before you know what you're trying to say." The girl nodded solemnly. "That's what I thought too." Later in the kitchen, he sat with one of the younger staff members, a quiet man named Arjun, who'd joined the quiet house just 2 months earlier. He had the kind of calm that invited trust and rarely spoke unless it mattered. "Do you ever regret it?" Arjun asked. "Leaving the company?" Arjun nodded. Richard thought about it. The question had stopped being painful years ago. Now it was just another part of the story, like a note early in the measure. "I don't regret leaving," he said. "I regret how long it took me to understand what I was leaving for." "And now?" Richard looked around, the quiet hum of the dishwasher, the creak of a floorboard overhead, the faint sound of 2 children laughing in the hall. "Now I just try to make sure I don't waste a single sound." That night he dreamed of Jonah, not the younger version, not the boy in the chair or the piano bench, but older, laughing, standing beside a table covered in wires and sketches and jars of sound. He was building something, or maybe tuning it, Richard couldn't quite tell, but Jonah looked up, smiled, and said, "You made it." "Made what?" Richard asked. "The rest of the song." Then the dream faded, soft as a breath. In the morning, he woke to birdsong and distant piano notes from one of the therapy rooms. He sat up slowly, stretched, and stood. There was work to do, as there always was. Plants to water, letters to read, new sound files submitted by children who had found their voices through rhythm and resonance. He walked through the hallway, trailing his fingers along the wall, and stopped by the original archive drawer. It was full again. He opened a new one, labeled it in his son's handwriting, copied from an old music sheet. "Still listening?" He smiled and began again. The weeks that followed were slow and golden. The air took on the gentle warmth of early summer, and everything seemed to soften around the edges. Children sprawled barefoot in the gardens, painting soundscapes on canvas. Some used brushes. Others pressed their palms in bright color and let the silence speak for them. The staff moved through the halls with practiced ease, greeting parents, listening without rushing, kneeling when needed. No one raised their voice. The quiet house didn't need to be quiet in the way the world imagined. It needed to feel safe. It needed to feel like breath. Richard took to walking the perimeter each morning just after sunrise. It was a habit Jonah had started, insisting that before any music was played, they listened to the world. Even on days when Jonah couldn't walk or even sit up on his own, Richard would carry him to the porch, wrap him in blankets, and hold him there until the sun hit the tips of the grass and the robins began their song. It had never been about exercise. It had always been about attention. The staff knew not to interrupt him during this time. They watched from windows, sipping coffee, sometimes following at a respectful distance, not out of obligation, but affection. There was something about the way Richard walked, slow, deliberate, head tilted, as if still expecting to hear a chord drop from the sky, that made people pause and listen themselves. One morning, on his circuit, he found a boy sitting on the edge of the reflecting pool, knees drawn to his chest, earbuds in. He was maybe 11 or 12, face drawn, eyes red, though he wiped them quickly when he saw Richard. "Sorry," he muttered. "I'm not supposed to be out here before breakfast." "You're not in trouble," Richard said gently, lowering himself to sit beside him. The boy didn't speak at first. Then he offered one of the earbuds. Richard took it. It was a Jonah piece, one of the earlier ones, raw and full of stuttered emotion, not polished like the later compositions, but still so clearly him. "My mom said I should come here after Dad died," the boy said, eyes fixed on the pool. "Said maybe being around other kids like me would help." Richard nodded. "Has it?" The boy shrugged. "I don't talk much, but I listen." "That's enough," Richard said. "That's the first step to anything real." The boy was silent a moment. Then he said, "I like this song. It's like someone else knows what it feels like to be too full to speak." Richard looked at him for a long time, then placed a hand gently on the boy's back. Jonah used to say music is the sound a soul makes when words are too small. That might be true for you, too. The boy didn't reply, but he didn't move away either. Later he joined the percussion class for the first time. He didn't play an instrument, just sat in the corner and tapped his fingers on a table in perfect rhythm. The staff made space for him, like they always did. By mid-July, the tulip beds had gone wild, curling at the edges, color bleeding into color like watercolor soaked through paper. Richard sat with a sketch pad in the shade and began drawing them. He was no artist. His hands shook, but that wasn't the point. He just wanted to remember how Jonah had seen the world in color and movement and small, perfect details. A staff member brought him lemonade, cool and tart. He drank it slowly, never taking his eyes off the blooms. That night the wind picked up. It rustled through the trees, ringing every wind chime hung across the property. Each one was tuned differently. Some to notes Jonah had loved, others to ambient tones collected from the archive. The air shimmered with harmony, accidental and perfect. A concert of chaos, shaped into something tender. Richard stood at the doorway to the garden and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't know who he was speaking to. Jonah, maybe, or the children inside, asleep and dreaming, or the version of himself from a lifetime ago who had once thought that raising a child with disabilities would be the end of his story. He now knew better. It had been the beginning. In the months that followed, something extraordinary began to unfold, so quietly, so organically, that Richard didn't even realize it at first. The quiet house had always welcomed children. It had always lifted them. But now those children were growing up. They were returning. They came back not as guests, but as mentors, guides, teachers. One girl who had arrived 5 years earlier without a single spoken word now taught rhythm through breath and hand motion. A boy who once refused to be touched now led an adaptive dance circle for children with cerebral palsy, his voice as steady as his feet had once been uncertain. And a group of teens who had grown up together at the house began meeting every Thursday in the corner room with floor pillows, planning their own center, one they would run, shape, open for others. They called themselves the Second Sound. Richard let them be. He watched as they sketched out budgets, argued over wall colors, tested music therapy schedules. He offered no advice unless asked. When they finally came to him with the proposal, it was hand-typed on thick paper, filled with spelling mistakes and absolute brilliance. "We want to use Jonah's blueprints," the leader, a tall boy named Felix, said. "Not literally, but in spirit." Richard read every page, then stood, extended his hand, and said, "Then I think you already know how to begin." The center opened 8 months later in a converted schoolhouse on the far end of the county. The mayor tried to cut a ribbon, but the kids had decided on a different kind of opening, a public sound walk, where visitors were guided blindfolded through an outdoor path strung with bells, chimes, and recorded messages from the children who built it. The final stop was a piano, with one key marked in blue, the same key. It had become more than a symbol. It had become a language. Richard stayed at the edge of the crowd that day. He didn't need credit. But as the first child pressed that blue-marked key and the sound rang out over the grass, he closed his eyes and felt it. The echo of every moment, every night, every lullaby and note and soft breath. Jonah was here, not in body, not in name, but in presence, in choice. He walked the path after everyone had gone, alone, pausing at each station, listening to the sounds recorded by the new generation. A whisper, a giggle, a rainstorm, someone exhaling, long and slow. At the piano he didn't play. He simply pressed the key once, held it, then let it fade. He returned to the quiet house that night and sat in the garden. No music, no lights, just the soft scurry of squirrels, the chirp of frogs, the world breathing in rhythm. He thought of the time he had almost said no, the moment he had considered turning away from the boy in the care home, the moment he had believed the voices that told him it was too much, too hard, too late, and what would have been lost if he had. He remembered Jonah's first words, his first steps, his first composition scratched in pencil and laughter. He remembered being changed, not all at once, not in one lightning bolt realization, but in the steady drip of love over time, the shaping of a heart. The empire he had once ruled had long since named a new CEO. It had grown, shrunk, morphed, pivoted. He no longer followed the news, but when he met someone who still remembered his name from that world, an investor, a founder, a venture capitalist, they always asked him the same thing. "What made you walk away from it all?" And he always gave the same answer. "I didn't walk away, I walked home." And he had, again and again every day since, even now, even always.